Good morning, everybody. It is fantastic to see you guys in chat. It is great to be with you again. For you guys who don't know me, I'm Joi Chevalier, and I am the CEO, founder, and owner of the Cook's Nook here in Austin, and just amazingly delighted to be with you again for our conference on food resiliency and access equity. And many thanks to Councilmember Fuentes for her opening remarks this morning. As always, she has been at the forefront of food ever since we met, back when she was still working with us in Del Valle. And, uh, and now she's on our council and she is still working tirelessly to bring forward the issues that we all share around food and food equity and food access. So, um, in addition to good morning, just a quick thank you to everybody to make today possible. Our team, um, Colin and Amazing Entertainment, and all of you. We're still doing this work. We met in January, and a lot of people came back and said, "Are we going to do it again?" So here we are. And we're really fortunate because this time we get to talk about that ongoing resilience and that ongoing change. And what does it look like to continue to do this work? And the council member's right. There is a bit of fatigue setting in, but we all know that there's still so much to do here. In Travis County alone, we know that our numbers look these days like 18% of adults are food insecure, and in children and young population, it's closer to 24 to 25% are food insecure. And unless we actively continue the measures and the new innovations that many of us have put into place, those numbers will keep rising. So there's still a lot of work to do. Um, so, are we ready? So our first conversation is with the amazing Karen Washington.
Hi,
And
dear.
hey, good morning, ma'am. I can't tell everybody how excited it is when I got to reach back out to you and you were going to be joining us today. So let me tell folks about you just a little bit, but I suspect everybody already knows. Um, so for you guys who don't know this amazing woman, Karen Washington is coming to us from the beauty that is New York, New York State. I don't know, you upstate, or you're back in the city at the
I'm
moment.
in the Boogie Down Bronx.
Oh, okay. She's up in the city. She's in the Boogie Down Bronx. That's awesome. Karen is a leader just in all things food and farm and creating just food and farm systems and access. She is a former board member and of the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition. See, that's too many C's for me. She is an amazing gardener, farmer, board member of the New York Botanical Gardens and New York City Community Gardens Coalition, the co founder of La Familia Verde Garden Coalition, um, launched the City Farms Market, right? Many of you guys will know her as also the co founder of Bugs, the Black Urban Growers. Which is probably the first time I heard about you was when Bugs started. Um, She's also a part of the Green Worker Cooperatives, and which builds and sustains worker-owned green businesses. So also a conversation around labor. Ebony Magazine voted her one of the 100 most influential African American leaders in 2012, but that continues today. We all know. And James Beard awarded her their leadership award as well. Um, she is just the queen to us who care about our farms, our communities, our growers, and how we um, take care of ourselves and each other through food and how that works. So, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Joy. This is great.
So, I know I said all of that. What do you want to tell people? How would you describe what you do and what you're doing these days?
I tell people that, first of all, I'm Karen Washington. I tell people I'm a farmer. I grow food. I feed people body, mind, and spirit.
Hmm.
I've been growing food for over 37 years. And I try to tell people I'm just an ordinary person trying to do extraordinary work. And And for me, I see a food system that has impacted my community. I live in the Bronx. I live in a low income neighborhood. I hate to use the word poor because those are outside the term. Because when I look at my community, I look at their resiliency, their strength with limited access to services. And when we talk about further about food, that I think this virus COVID has just highlighted the food insecurities that we all commonly had known before, that was really impacting our communities. And so when I see injustice, I just try to shout it out. I'm an agitator. I get under people's nerves, but that's okay.
Well, to that end, about your local food system. I mean, Councilmember Fuentes talked about our system, but what do you think COVID has shown about your Bronx and the upstate local food system there? What is it further exposed for you up there?
I love to listen. I love to hear exactly what Council person Fuentes has said, because it's similar. It's similar. If you live in a black or brown low income community, both urban and rural,
Mhm.
you have seen what COVID has done. It has just exacerbated the problem when it came to food insecurity that we all knew what was happening before COVID. The fact that we had a food system that failed us, that continues to fail us. We live in the greatest country in the world, where we grow enough food and we waste enough food, yet we have 40 million people still in poverty. That's unacceptable. We have a food system that has black and brown folks getting their food from food pantries and soup kitchens. That is not sustainable. Yes, they did a great job during the pandemic because they're supposed to be used for emergency purposes, but they're not supposed to be used as an everyday solution to food and hunger. And so, listening to her talk, I'm glad that she said, and it's really, really important, that food system, in terms of the inequity that we see, it starts within the grassroots community level.
Mhm. When you talked about this, I know our conversations on bridging divides, but you and she both linked that the experience for rural and urban um, lack of access is similar. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, people often want to break this into the experiences are completely different in rural and in urban settings, but we keep yoking these together. Can you talk about that shared experience? Why is it? How is it the same?
Poor is poor. You know what I'm saying? Poor is poor. If I mean, being poor is poor, regardless if you're urban or rural. If you don't have access to food and you don't have the means to buy food or to provide for shelter, poor is
Yeah,
poor.
yeah,
And so we need to start having systems divide us. And so, how do we tackle the problem of hunger and poverty broad base, in a sense that we can sort of deal with it instead of trying to divide it? Well, this is an urban problem. Oh, this is a rural problem. Poor is poor.
it's true. No, absolutely. And people, talk about myths. People seem to think that you can't have you can't have a lack of food access in a rural area. And when you tell them, yes, you can, they seem to be shocked by that concept.
And I
Um,
think it really was really poignant to see in rural communities. See, in local communities and cities in urban areas, you could maybe take a bus or a subway. In rural communities, they depend mostly on a car or a truck. And so it was just magnified to see that when there were lack of food in grocery stores, or where they had to travel to a food pantry or a soup kitchen, they had to have a means of transportation. They had to have a car or a truck to get there.
yeah.
So again, we need to talk about the means of transportation as well. And again, we don't have that in our conversation.
No, that transportation and housing are both inextricably linked to food access. All three of them together are just inextricably linked. Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that you have been really vocal about is this naming and using, and the council member used the term around food deserts. Um, Do you want to, can you mind giving a little definition that you believe you've talked about food desert versus food apartheid? And do you want to chat about that just a little bit? I know you've given a talk on that in recent weeks.
Yeah, I've been talking about that for ages, and I
I know.
well, you know what? First of all, when I first heard the term food deserts, it's a lot of black and brown folks, when we first heard the term food deserts, we were somewhat surprised that again, outsider labeling our community and not really dealing with the problems, the social problems that we were having. So they're calling our neighborhood food deserts. And we felt that, first of all, it seemed too surreal. It didn't
Mm,
really offer any context to the fact that we're dealing with hunger and poverty here. And then I started, when people started to be outraged about using that term food deserts, the next term I heard was food swamp. So we're not gonna call it a food desert, we're gonna call it a food swamp. And I said, what? And then I just recently heard it went from food swamps to food mirage. Folks,
wait a minute, food what?
mirage.
Okay, I've not heard food
Oh,
mirage.
please.
That's one I have not heard.
Well, honey, food mirage,
Food mirage.
no mirage, no swamp, no deserts.
Yeah,
And I say that because I wanted to coin the term food apartheid
yeah,
because I wanted people to start having these hard conversations, peel
yeah,
away the problem, hunger and poverty, racial discrimination, lack of access to food, inequality when it comes to wealth, loss of land,
yeah.
all of these things that we need to talk about when we talk about the food system and what food justice is all about. And so for me, the definition of food justice really is the transformation of the food system to eliminate some of the food disparities that we see in our food system. And I say that word transformation because the idea of food justice has been co-opted.
Yeah.
You know, people say that people have their own definitions, they pad their RFPs, they pad their mission and vision, while really not understanding that food justice is a active movement. It's a movement. And so if you're dealing with food justice, you have to be actively working on dismantling some of the social. When people talk about food justice, I want to know, so what you doing about it?
Yeah.
Don't tell me or point to in your mission and your vision statement, or you can give me a cookie cutting definition. What are you doing to stem the tide of the social injustices that you see actively involved in dismantling that?
When So, as part of even dealing with the simple, I won't say simple because it's not simple, dealing with the most obvious aspect of food access, if you're going to be engaged with work, you have to have a conversation around housing, around other inequitable portions. How does one approach that? How do you say, if I'm in on food, I have to be all in on everything else too? I have to recognize that there are other determinants around that, and that seems to be a lot for people, and I think that's where some people struggle.
So you know what? For me, I'm going to talk about myself personally because when I was starting to concentrate just on growing food in my
Hmm.
community, I started to hear the social issues and I started to hear the impact food was having on the environment. People, you know, in low income neighborhoods complaining of increase in asthma or
Hmm.
living near a incinerator.
Hmm.
The intersection that food had when it came to housing, the
Hmm.
lack of affordable housing, no heat or hot water, the intersection food had when it came to economics, poor living wages, no jobs, the intersection that food had when it came, of course, to health. Being a healthcare professional, I saw that. You know, I saw that food was the intersection of all these social issues. Yes, it can be overwhelming, but I tell people start at the local level. Start at a local level issue. So if that issue is, you know, you're living near an empty lot, it's full of garbage. Well, then locally deal with that empty lot. How can you turn that empty lot, like we did in New York City, into community gardens? If it's about affordable housing, how do you collectively deal with issues when it comes to affordable housing? And these are some of the things that, you know, I try to get people to focus on the local level in your neighborhood and don't get caught up in the broad base problems that you see statewide or
Mhm.
nationally, but focus right on your immediate neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that you recommend that to people, and just tackling. I'm gonna say hate the phrase "stay in your lane," but it's not about staying in your lane. It's about creating and carving out that place where you can have the most effect and impact, for you, an audience, a group of people, right? And really honing in deeply in in that area, right? And then if a lot of different people own a lot of different areas, right? Then you start to move things as a group. You know, at least that seems that way to me. You know, that is an approach, because I do hear from some people a lot of times, and maybe that's where the fatigue comes from. They want to back away, um, when they realize where all the tendrils actually end up going.
But Joy, I'm starting to see, I'm an elder, I got the gray hair, but I'm energized by this youth movement. I'm energized by this Black and Brown youth movement when it comes to the food movement, who are unapologetic,
Yeah,
that see what is happening in their community and now want to do something about it. And so I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful that there's lessons to be learned from COVID, but
hmm,
yet I don't see them just sitting by and letting things happen anymore. I
yeah,
think that they're out there, as Black Lives Matter, Food Lives Matter. I think people are out there really starting to have those hard conversations, especially around food, on the fact that this country is built on the backs of enslaved and indigenous people.
yeah,
It's very, very hard for people to hear. People feel threatened when you talk about land reparations. They feel threatened when they feel that also the federal government wants to do a Black Farmers Act
yeah,
now to talk about restitution for Black farmers in terms of a lack of access to land being stolen, or the fact that there's limited resources. And there are people in cities are up in arms, and they don't understand that there has been a history of neglect, of racism, of wealth inequalities and inequities in this country that we tend not to talk about.
yeah,
And so we need to have those hard conversations. We need also the power dynamics, the fact that
hmm,
it's predicted at 2050 that there'll be an additional 2 billion people on this planet. Yet the power and control of the food system is a handful of white men who own
yeah,
companies. And
yeah,
so we need to have those hard conversations on how do we shift the power dynamics that we see from those who have had power over us for so many years back into the hands of the people so that they control their own destiny.
yeah. I'm going to shout out Tiffany, who's over here in chat talking the same thing. Good old Tiffany Washington over here, um, because that leads to the question and the concept that Tiff is bringing up, which is, and you've already started to bring up, is around self sufficiency and ownership, and and ownership can take a whole bunch of forms. I'm just using that term
Mhm.
most in its most broad way. What is that? So then, what does that look like? What does that ownership start to look like? I mean, you guys created Rise and Root Farm. What does it mean to create gardens, create community gardens, or have ownership of your food system, or your most localized, hyper local food system? What does that look like?
Not only the food system, but also the wealth and
And the
economics.
wealth, the economics and distribution onto
Oh,
the
baby.
whole thing.
So I try to tell young people, folks, first of all, I think, now that I'm older and I understand, because growing up, farming was equated to slave work. I mean, that was point in my head until I understand that how powerful the land is and how powerful our connection to land is as agrarian people. This is part of our ancestry.
Mhm.
And so understanding, and you use a great word. I know you use it in terms of context of ownership. I like to say stewardship. And I
Mhm.
say, I look at us being stewards of the land. The land is given to us because we really can't own anything because we don't live long enough to own. But looking at being stewards of the land, taking care of the land, understanding where that land has handed down from generation to generation, and making sure that you're taking care of it for the next generation. That's one thing. So now, when I talk to young people, I tell them, take out those Samsung Galaxies and those iPhones, and talk to your great grandparents, aunt or uncle, abuela, to
Mm,
get that history. We've lost that history. We've lost that connection to land. And I want people to understand, especially young people, black and brown young people, to understand that your great grandparents, they grew up on farms and they grew up on gardens. They
mhm,
didn't rely on a supermarket or a bodega. They went out and got their food. When they were sick, they used medicinal plants.
mhm,
So a lot of that is being lost. And so now we're trying to talk about the effects of indigenous principles, of things that have been handed down from generation to generation, and people going back to the land to gather their power. That's number one.
mm,
Number two, another organization that I've helped start is the Black Farmer Fund. And we started the Black Farmer Fund, which is concentrated in New York State, because we realize when we talk about food insecurity and we're talking about how to make food just for all, who's growing the food? Who's growing? So let's take a broad picture. Who is growing the food? So we found out of 57,000 farmers in New York State, only 139 are black.
mm,
Like what? 139 are black. So what does that look like, the food system, when the majority of
mhm,
people who are food insecure are black and brown people, but yet the people growing the food are not there? And so again, thinking about capital in a way that's not extractive or not exploitative,
mhm,
but in a way that builds social capital and communal wealth. Things that we don't talk about within our community because we have been designated, we're food deserts, we're poor, there's scarcity, there's problems.
mhm,
And shifting that notion about people who for so long have limited resources but have gotten together to survive. And we need to talk about, how do we build communal wealth? How do we start having those conversations to take us off the SNAP, off the food lines, off the soup kitchens, and start talking about base building economically within our community? Because, folks, let me tell you something. Collectively, black and brown people collectively have communal wealth. We tend to extract that wealth and bring it out of our communities. We shop outside of our communities. We rent outside our communities. We work outside our communities. We travel outside our communities. So the notion now is thinking about, what does communal wealth look like? What is it to be self-sufficient and self-reliant? And
mhm,
that is thinking about base building, thinking about starting having a conversation, and how do we make sure that the economic system that we have, the money that we have, the resources that we have, are brought back into our community. Start talking about how to repair credit. How do we thinking about ownership, ownership of organizations, ownership of businesses, instead of always being with our hands out, thinking about our hands in. And also, when it comes to the policy around food, having a seat at the table. And folks, if we don't have a seat at the table, we're going to make our own table and bring our own chairs. And so this is the conversation that I'm starting to see when we talk about what the social capital and communal wealth. How do we bring within our communities that topic of self-sufficiency and self-reliance
yeah.
is the control of land and the control of wealth.
The the capitalist model has the hero, savior, singular owner as the model, right? And what you're talking about is not that. And so those always are in, they always appear to be in conflict. So it's very hard to sort of explain or sort of get across, as you've done so eloquently, about what does it mean to have hands in this communal wealth and this communal ownership, a different model, that there is wealth in the garden, in the community, within the group. And that's really powerful, but it's really hard to explain and get across to people. You know, I wonder if that's something that is, it's old. It's really old, and you're talking about going back to something that predates what's done today, which is really really fascinating. I mean, you're familiar with our friends like Adrian and Michael Twitty and everybody who's working on Maloma, who are saying similar things, right? You know, how do we go back to agricultural and ownership, shared ownership practices that the group that represents the group and the communal wealth that you're talking about. But those are really old. And I always find that people have a little bit of difficulty when you try to convey that to them, you know.
And a lot of it's also people are fearful of the truth.
Mm,
And then we also need to talk, Joy, this is really important that we haven't had a conversation about trauma
yeah.
within our community. And trauma in our community, when people feel trauma, there is a lack of trust. And so people have to recognize that
Mm,
within our communities, because there's been so much harm, you know, um, and trauma, that you have to gain our trust. You have to gain our trust. And for so long, we have been used, we have been misused, we have been victimized. And so it starts with developing trust so that you can sit down and have those hard conversations. Because a lot of references that people get from when they look at Black and Brown communities, because they never enter our communities, they're not there in our communities, they don't know how we live.
mhm,
They get their reference from the media, what
mhm,
they see on TV or the sound bites that they hear on the radio. And so I tell people time and time again, you know, it's time for people to get out of their comfort zone and see how people live and strive in communities of color that are barely trying to make it.
mhm,
Because a lot of people, when they talk about statistics and they talk about our community, they don't live in our community. They don't experience our community. They just figure that this is how it's supposed to be without living in our community, without
mhm,
spending time in our community, not developing leadership in our community, not asking us to have a seat at the table, you know, to solve the problems that we have in our communities. It's always been top down. And the reference has always been external from what the media puts out.
mhm. No, you're absolutely right. And so now I'm just curious, how do you drag people into that experience? You don't want to drag people into experience. How do you how? how?
You meet people where they are. You meet people where they are. For instance, so I'm gonna in my community garden. It's like, so how do you get people? How do you get youth in your community garden? How do you get people to understand that they have the ability and they have the right to have food?
Mm,
That is a human right.
yeah.
So, I always get young people into my community garden by
Mhm,
doing a barbecue and having some music.
yeah.
And then sitting down and having those conversations. That's number one. Up on our farm, believe it or not, we reach out. We reach out to our community. People, Joy, why am I here? Because you reached out to me.
Yeah.
And we don't have a tendency to go out of our comfort zone to reach people to come in.
Mhm,
Come into my community, come into my garden, visit my farm, see how things are. I can't tell you how many farmers come into our community. They'll come in our community outside from our community, come down into the Bronx and other areas in marginalized community, but they don't invest in that community.
mhm.
So they bring their wares, we pay for their wares, and then they leave our community.
Right.
What without even inviting us to come up to the farm and to see where the food comes from.
Right.
And so, again, starting having those hard conversations where we invite people to have a shared experience. And I think that's being lost. Growing up, I remember, sitting around the table. You know how we do. We invite people to share a meal during the
Yeah.
holidays or without the
Mhm,
holidays and sit at the table and feed them. And we're missing that. We're in silos, we're in isolation. This pandemic has forced us into isolation.
sure.
And hopefully, as we move beyond the pandemic, that we will start thinking about what social capital and communal wealth means and base building and get back to what the essence of agriculture is all about is culture, which embodies diversity and inclusion.
I'm Karen sitting here stunned. Okay, everybody, everything she just said, go out and make that happen somehow. Go out and do that now. That would be great. I want to check real quick because I am really emotional about what you're saying. Um I just am. When you guys don't know, when we first came in, before everything started, Karen and I were talking, and I was lamenting. It wasn't a total lament that my family was telling me that they were coming to me for holidays, and even as I said it, and then Karen responded about the beauty of my family coming to see me. It really was about that. It was about reconnecting and reopening that table again and having people come back into the house and come back into our lives and coming back into our food and making the food again, right? And then also having my friends come because they always would come for Christmas, Thanksgiving, and
Mhm.
reopening that back up again. And you're right. And maybe there is some level of that where that even maybe that I didn't even recognize how much COVID has shrunk our little universes even further into those silos. And that and we're getting to a point we have to do this again. We have to go back to that and expand again.
Thank you for those thoughts.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Um, I know we're nearing the end of our time, so I want to make sure, at least I think I am. I want to make sure that we get questions from folks, and I'm not missing questions anywhere or anything out there. Oh, Phyllis has question. Phyllis is amazing. So Phyllis Everett, can you see that,
Yes,
Karen?
I see.
Phyllis,
Uh-huh.
Phyllis is the executive director of one of our nonprofit Saffron's Women's Trust here in town. I am a nonprofit. I want to learn more about community farming. How do we let our community know about policy in our community surrounding our food systems? Okay, so is that two different
Yeah,
parts? That's two different parts. You want to address those?
yeah. So, well, there are a lot of people that want to farm. I don't know what the particulars are or what are the the laws and regulations of farming in your city. I know for New York City, if you happen to come upon a vacant lot and it's not privately owned and the city owns it, you can have a license agreement for 4 years as long as you have 10 people. And you can get resources from the city to start a garden. Again, we have to make sure that this is what the community wants and not an individual idea, because there's many times where community farms are built and the community doesn't entertain, doesn't go into it, because it's never started from them. So that's one thing we have to be careful of. Another thing about the politics, I always tell people land in a municipality has political consequences.
It
And I
does.
say that because we're at a point in time where we have to balance the need for land to grow food and for affordable housing. And I speak to urban planners that you can do both. You can build apartment buildings and have rooftop gardens. You can build apartment buildings and incorporate a garden. And then you have to make sure that what's the policy when it comes to around food and growing food in cities. We had to work very hard to make the city understand that we there is legislation intact that allows you to grow food in cities. Some cities there is restriction on what you can do in terms of land and growing food. We had to fight the fact that they told us that we couldn't have chickens and we couldn't have roosters. Well, we found out, yes, we can have chickens, but we can't have roosters because of the noise. And thirdly, they told us that we couldn't have bees because bees under the health department was listed as ferocious animals. And anyone who knows about farming or gardening, if you don't have bees, you don't have food. So now we can have bees. So again, you have to look in within your city charter. What are some of the rules and regulations that they are around growing in your city or your town? But then fight back to make sure it happens. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we did. We marched on City Hall to change a lot of the restrictions that we have. So great question, and the best of luck.
Yeah, Phyllis, thank you, Karen, for that. She's absolutely right. There's a multiple levels here, You can also reach out to in our community garden. These guys know a lot of the guys who are in chat. They actually really know here because many of them are doing them. Tiffany certainly knows. Somebody mentioned Andrea Abel over at Farm Share as well. There's also a community garden specialist that's dedicated in the city of Austin. I think that is technically in Parks and Rec, but there is a dedicated community gardens person you could also reach out to. Urban farm is slightly different, and there's a fine line between the two. And so you can talk to Office of Sustainability about that as well. So there are a few folks in the city of Austin and in the community, in farming community. I'm going to be specific, and it's and like Tiffany does say, and Karen it says it can be tough, absolutely. So you got to be clear. Okay, we got another question there.
Okay.
I'm a founder of a company Feed Forward that focuses on using tech to disrupt and revolutionize the food system. How can we work more closely with you on the storytelling aspect in our community?
That's a very, very good question and excellent question because technology now is at the forefront when people talk about urban agriculture, and also when we talk about farming in general. And so there's two ways to look at technology. One, that it helps farming, and on the other hand, to make sure that the data that is collected from technology isn't being used
Mhm,
against communities, especially communities of color.
mhm,
And so um, I think when it comes to storytelling, it's always asking people, having a seat at the table and asking people what their concerns. And again, with technology, there is that trust level because so many people, especially Black and Brown people, have been harmed because of technology. The data is being used. There's no transparency. You get this information, you don't know what's happening with that information. How is it being disseminated? Where is it going? And again, when it comes to technology can be somewhat expensive, especially for small farmers. And so, how do we make sure that technology is available for all people who grow food? That's number one. There's still a digital divide when it comes to technology and access to the internet. Again, we have to make sure that if we're talking about food justice and we're talking about increasing a food economy that's fair and just, that there's equal opportunity for all levels of people to be engaged in technology and to understand the power that technology has to help and the power that technology has a hand to harm. So again, sort of the balance, both when it comes to technology, but that is the wave of the future. How we can control it to make sure that it doesn't displace the human aspect of us growing food, that there is still that baseline of culture, of indigenous practices, of our stewardship of the land, that doesn't be tossed to the side because technology feels that it can do a much better job when it comes to our food system. So great question, and thank you for that.
yeah. Excuse me. I was just going to say that technology also has to, and as a technologist, that it also has to generate this word that you used a few times, which is trust. That people have to be that technology and technologists have to prove themselves trustworthy in these spaces, right? And that is on the technologist side, that it can be trustworthy with the data, with what it's bringing forward, that it does have the interest of people at heart, that it does understand what's happening in those local communities and amongst particular communities and populations, so they can be trustworthy partners in that engagement. The amazing Mark Kaplan, another refresh friend. Uh, Mark says, given the COVID initiated movement to remote working that seems permanent, yes, is there a movement to convert empty office buildings into vertical farming facilities?
I would like to see empty office buildings be used for community resources and use. There's so many, you know, there's so many of us that are grassroots organizations that are doing the work, but we don't have a place. You know, real estate in cities are so expensive, and yet after you know five at one time before the pandemic, people went home and these spaces were empty. Now that there's more remote um, working conditions, again, these spaces are empty. This is a great opportunity for community-based organizations to be in those spaces to run their organizations.
Yeah.
Vertical farming can be done on the outside of the building. That can be done. But how about inside the building? How about inside the building where we can transfer these spaces into the hands of the community so that they can do their work in
Mm.
these empty spaces? I mean, grassroots communities of color, they need space. And this is a perfect example where they can use that space at this point in time. And like I said, the vertical farming, while they're inside doing the work inside the office space, you can do the vertical farming outside on the walls or
Yeah.
on the rooftop.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Mark, I've met a couple companies who are doing that. One I was on a panel with earlier this year, but as long as those spaces still have value, and those in the real estate and VC real estate community feel those have value, I'd be hard pressed to watch them want to uh, downgrade use, to turn those actually into vertical farming facilities.
Another thing I want to talk about these spaces is now is the time where we all know who the essential workers are, the people that work in these companies that need childcare. Why don't the companies that are asking workers to come back take a floor and turn it into a childcare facility so that when a worker comes to their job, the top floor is childcare. The employees have already hired someone to take care of their child so that when people come to work, they feel comfortable. There's childcare services right on the premises. Use those empty office space for childcare facility,
Yeah.
and you'll get people to come back into the office.
There's a and maybe it's orthogonal to the farming use, though the refrigeration and cold storage use, which a few people are bringing up, keeps that value in that space as well. Another question, because we only have a couple minutes left.
Oh
Our
God.
501(c)(3) is set up to provide back-end admin and financial support for community-led foodways and gardens. We've been asking lots of them questions. What kinds of things do leaders, and I presume in food and in farm spaces, what do you say leaders need the most support with?
That's a good question. I always tell people you need to go into the communities and ask leaders and people in their community what they want, not what they need. You go into communities, you ask us what we need, it comes from a position of deficit. Go into our community and ask us what we want, comes from a position of power.
No, I like that. I like that reframing totally. We only have a couple minutes left. Is there another one? Oh, here's another question. As the only Black farmer in my community, it can be a fine line between operating my business and advocating for my rights. And as you say, a seat at the table. How do you balance the advocacy and the work?
I do both at doing both at the same time. While I'm working, I'm doing advocacy. While I'm in that garden, I'm yelling and screaming and talking to people on the telephone, my politicians and people, what I'm saying? Don't separate the two.
Yeah,
Balance. You can do both.
yeah. Tammy, I would love to see folks come out and just like I did, and come and see your place and see your gardens, walk your field.
Yeah.
I would love to make folks to be able to come do that. That would be fantastic. Any other questions? I'm gonna ask Jessica because I know she's posting them for us. If not, I'm gonna give the last words to. Oh, there's another one. Given your decades of growing experience in activism, what questions are we not asking that we should be?
Why is there hunger and poverty in the greatest country in the world? We grow enough food and we waste enough food, and that food is not getting down to the people that need it the most.
Yep. Why is it so badly distributed and
Why?
dispersed?
And why is when they ask us to eat healthy, it's so expensive?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Madam, tell folks what you are doing next. And if you like, how to reach you and your team and everybody around you. What's going on with you next?
Yes, so I am closing the chapter of my life here in New York. Love. I've been in New York all my life, 67 years, and I'm opening up a new chapter as I move to Georgia. So for me, the pandemic has really changed the outlook. I've lost a lot of friends because of COVID, and being in isolation, really had a strong hunger to be with family. And my
Yeah.
family is in Georgia, and I look forward to writing books and coming up with a podcast with my daughter, who is a educator and a leader, and having some fun with that. I'm on Facebook, Karen Young Washington. My farm is Rising Root Farm. You can always reach out to me. I always try to answer, people's messages, and they reach out to me. Like I said, I'm just an ordinary person trying to do extraordinary work.
And you do, and we are all the better for it. I'm better for it. We're better for it. You give so much to us all the time, ma'am, and I am just edified by you every time I get to see you and speak to you.
You're the best, Joy. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing as well.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody. Okay, that's our keynote. I've already made us 2 minutes behind. Have a great day. Talking to everybody.